Okay, let's unpack this fascinating topic. Imagine the world right after World War II. The devastating global conflict is over, the dust is settling, but a new kind of tension is already rising, quickly dividing the globe.
Yeah, it didn't take long, did it?
No, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerge from the ashes not just as victors, but as these, well, colossal forces, each pushing a fundamentally different political and economic vision for the future.
Right, polar opposites in many ways.
Exactly. The world isn't just splitting along national borders anymore. It's rapidly calcifying into rigid opposing blocs. It was a time our sources describe as a strange war, fought not with direct military clashes between the main adversaries, but with, acute tension, aggressive bloc building,
Proxy conflict.
proxy conflicts, and
The-
diplomacy conducted pretty precariously between hostile camps.
That atmosphere of suspicion and enforced allegiance really defined the international landscape for decades. It felt like you were either with us or against us, or so it seemed.
And yet, in the midst of this intense bipolar standoff, a radically different idea began to take shape. It was an idea championed primarily by nations that were themselves just emerging from centuries of colonial rule, sort of blinking into the light of newfound independence. A whole different perspective.
This idea was non-alignment. For this deep dive, we're going to explore what non-alignment truly meant, not just as a slogan, but as a policy and maybe a philosophical stance.
Okay.
We'll look at why so many nations, with a particular focus on India as a key architect, chose this path, how the policy evolved and adapted over time, weathering storms and criticisms, and crucially, whether it holds any relevance in the complex multipolar world we navigate today.
And our guide for this exploration comes from excerpts of an academic text on international relations. So these sources give us those essential definitions, rich historical context, varying perspectives from scholars who've, analyzed the policy,
Right.
and detailed analysis of India's specific journey with non-alignment through its different phases. Our mission for you, the listener, is to move beyond a simple definition and gain a really clear, nuanced understanding of non-alignment. We want you to see it not just as a historical footnote of the Cold War, but as a dynamic policy and a significant movement with deep philosophical roots and a changing but, well, potentially enduring relevance.
And why should you care today?
Exactly. Why is this relevant to you sitting here today? Because understanding this pivotal post-war concept is essential. It shines a powerful light on how a significant portion of the world, the so-called Third World, navigated a deeply divided era. It shows us the strategies newly independent nations employed to assert their autonomy, prioritize their own interests, and lay the groundwork for independent foreign policy, a concept that absolutely resonates today as nations of all sizes continue to grapple with global power dynamics, choose their partners, and assert their sovereignty in a complex international system.
It's fundamentally about understanding the struggle for and the exercise of autonomous decision-making on the world stage, isn't it? A struggle that continues, maybe in different forms.
So let's jump right into where this all began. We've already set the stage. The immediate post-WWII tension between the U.S.-led capitalist Western Democratic Bloc and the Soviet-led socialist Eastern Soviet Bloc. This wasn't a hot war between them, but a strange war of nerves, ideology, and influence where neutrality felt almost impossible.
Yeah, pressure from both sides.
It was in this environment that the concept of non-alignment was conceived.
And our sources make a striking claim right at the outset. Non-alignment is India's contribution to international relations. It's firmly attributed to India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru.
Right, Nehru.
He announced the broad framework of this policy remarkably early in September 1946, even before India formally gained independence in August 1947. He wasn't waiting for the dust to settle. He was proactively articulating India's intended stance in the emerging global order.
That timing is significant, isn't it? It shows it wasn't just a reactive policy formed years into the Cold War, but an almost foundational principle for independent India's foreign policy. Nehru's early statements were clear. In September 1946, he declared, "We propose, as far as possible, to keep away from the power politics of groups aligned against one another. You know, the kind that led to world wars."
And which may again lead to disasters on even vaster scale. He saw the danger.
He did. By 1947, he explicitly stated that India did not belong to any of the power blocs. His goal was ambitious. We shall make history of our choice.
That ambition to make history of our choice, that's really central. It encapsulates the desire for agency, for not being just a pawn in someone else's game.
Yeah.
The idea was that aligning with one bloc meant sacrificing a degree of that self-determination and, well, getting dragged into conflicts that weren't necessarily your own.
But what did this actually mean in practice? It wasn't passive, was it?
No, definitely not passive.
Yeah.
Professor M.S. Rajan, a key figure cited in our sources, offers a crucial definition. He says non-alignment essentially consists in the retention of a substantial measure of freedom of policy and action in international affairs,
Freedom of policy and action.
especially in relation to the policies and postures of the two superpowers.
Okay.
And he expands on this, stating it also entails abstention from power politics, for peaceful coexistence, and for active international cooperation among all states aligned and non-aligned.
So it's not just about the negative act of not joining a bloc, it's a positive thing.
Well, exactly. It's a positive, active policy aimed at maintaining independence, promoting peace through coexistence, and fostering cooperation across the global spectrum, including, interestingly, with the very blocs one isn't joining.
That phrase, freedom of policy and action, really is the heart of it, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
It means a non-aligned country operates independently, evaluating each international issue, whether it's a vote at the UN, a stance on a conflict, or a bilateral relationship, and deciding its position solely based on its own perceived merit and national interests.
Not because it's dictated by a bloc leader.
Right. Our source characterizes this as positive or dynamic neutralism.
And the source is careful to distinguish this from a negative middle-of-the-road reluctance to distinguish between right and wrong. Nehru himself was adamant about this.
He was.
Oh, yes. In a powerful address to the U.S. Congress in 1948, he clarified, "Where freedom is menaced, or justice is threatened, or where aggression takes place, we cannot be and shall not be neutral."
So not neutral on principle.
Our policy is not neutralist, but one of active endeavor to preserve and, if possible, establish peace on firm foundations.
That quote is so important. It underscores that non-alignment wasn't about moral apathy or equivalence. It was about retaining the independence to act in defense of principles like freedom and justice, and to actively work for peace without being constrained by the dictates of a military alliance. It was deeply intertwined with promoting international peace, security, and cooperation, often through platforms like the United Nations.
Yeah, a non-aligned country could, in theory, vote against the U.S. one day and the USSR the next, based purely on the issue at hand and its own interests.
Which must have seemed quite radical at the time.
It demanded a certain self-confidence, I think, and a belief in the ability of a newly independent nation to exercise its judgment on the global stage.
Okay, so we have a foundational understanding of what non-alignment aimed to be: independent, active, principled, and peace-oriented. But as with any complex policy, there was significant confusion and misinterpretation, particularly from those embedded within the existing bloc structure.
Oh, definitely.
It's just as crucial to understand what non-alignment wasn't.
Absolutely. Let's clarify some common confusions, because they really colored how the policy was perceived, especially in the West. The first and most frequent mistake was equating non-alignment with classical neutrality, or a more modern idea of neutralism.
Right, they sound similar, and the source is very precise here. What's the core distinction?
Okay, so classical neutrality is a specific legal status of a country during a time of war. A neutral country refrains from assisting any of the belligerents in a conflict.
Like Switzerland during the World Wars.
Well, Switzerland is more neutralization. We'll get to that. But think of the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. The source cites this as an example where India adopted a neutral stance. It maintained friendly relations with both Iran and Iraq, but didn't provide military support to either.
Okay.
The Oxford Dictionary definition given is clear. One not assisting either side, and specially lending no active support to either of the belligerents, remaining inactive in relation to either party in the case of war.
So neutrality is strictly a wartime posture. Non-alignment was designed for peacetime foreign policy.
Precisely. Professor Rajan explicitly contrasts the two. Non-alignment is not the neutrality of a non-belligerent nation during a general war, nor is it the neutrality of the Swiss and the Austrian brand, guaranteed by other nations.
Ah, okay, so that brings us to the Swiss and Austrian brand. That's neutralization, right?
Yes, exactly. Neutralization is a permanent status, applicable in both peace and war. And crucially, it's typically guaranteed by other states, often major powers.
Guaranteed by others.
Yes, who agree to respect the neutralized state's integrity, on the condition that the neutralized state refrains from taking sides or forming alliances in international disputes. Switzerland is the classic example. its permanent neutrality recognized for centuries. Austria's neutralized status came later, recognized by the superpowers after the 1955 State Treaty.
So neutralization is a legally binding, permanent commitment, often imposed or guaranteed externally. Feels quite different.
Very different. A non-aligned country, by contrast, makes a sovereign policy choice not to join military blocs. It is not committed to a permanent neutralized status and is free to be friendly with countries from both blocs and make decisions as it sees fit.
More flexible.
Much more flexible. Non-alignment, as initially conceived, was a policy tied to the specific context of the Cold War and that core desire for freedom of decision-making, not a fixed permanent status guaranteed by others, like neutralization.
Okay, so not neutrality, not neutralization. What about isolationism? Is non-alignment about withdrawing from the world, sticking your head in the sand?
Far from it. This is another significant point of confusion that the sources address head-on. Isolationism means total aloofness from the problems and affairs of other countries.
Like the U.S. for certain periods.
Exactly. Historical examples include the United States before World War I, guided by the Monroe Doctrine, and again for a period after the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, when it sort of withdrew from the League of Nations and focused inward.
That sounds diametrically opposed to everything we've just said about non-alignment being active and dynamic.
It is. Our sources are crystal clear. Non-aligned countries do not remain unconcerned with international relations or the problems facing other nations. They actively participate in world politics,
Active?
engaging in diplomacy, joining international organizations, and taking stances on global issues. The key difference is not being permanently tied down or obligated to follow the lead of any superpower. Professor Rajan emphasizes this. Non-alignment is anything but isolationism. It means and demands an active, dynamic, and positive role in world affairs.
That active, dynamic, and positive role is definitely the opposite of aloofness. Okay, one more distinction to the idea of equidistance or equivalence.
Ah, yes, this was a common interpretation, particularly in Western analyses, that non-alignment meant maintaining precisely equal relations with both sides. Peter Calvacaresi is mentioned as suggesting this.
Like a mathematical balancing act?
Kind of, and our sources strongly push back against this interpretation. K.P. Misra is quoted insisting, and I think this is a vital point, that non-blossicism does not imply equidistance from blocks.
Okay, so it wasn't about keeping things perfectly balanced on a scale.
No, the policy was never about mathematical precision in relationships. It wasn't about ensuring that if you visited Washington 3 times, you had to visit Moscow 3 times, or that trade volumes had to be exactly balanced. That wasn't the point.
So what was the actual principle guiding relationships with the blocs then?
The text clarifies the nuanced reality. If, in order to preserve independence, a closer relationship with one bloc is called for, such a relationship should be permissible.
Permissible. Okay.
Provided the relationship is not allowed to be transformed into a commitment, which circumscribes the exercise of sovereignty by the country concerned. This is absolutely crucial for understanding non-alignment in practice.
Right, so you could lean closer to one side if needed.
As long as it didn't lock you in. It underscores that the core principle wasn't rigid equidistance, but the preservation of independence, of action and sovereignty. A non-aligned country could strategically cultivate a closer relationship with one superpower or bloc on certain issues, or for specific needs like economic aid or security, as long as that relationship didn't become a binding alliance or commitment that limited its freedom to decide future issues independently.
That flexibility, guided by national interest and the ultimate goal of preserving independence, is what distinguished it from rigid neutrality, or that idea of mathematical equidistance. It was about strategy and sovereignty, not perfect balance.
Precisely. It was about exercising judgment on a case-by-case basis, free from prior commitments to one side.
With that clearer picture of what non-alignment is and isn't, let's explore why India and other newly independent nations chose this, well, demanding path. What were the underlying reasons and objectives?
Okay. Our sources frame non-alignment primarily as an essential instrument or means of foreign policy, designed to give fuller meaning and content to India's newly achieved political independence.
So making independence real on the world stage.
Exactly. Independence from colonial rule was the first step, but it was understood that true sovereignty in a world dominated by powerful blocs required an independent foreign policy as well. Political independence had to be safeguarded and complemented by foreign policy independence.
And the ultimate objective of this instrument, like any nation's foreign policy, was what?
Well, the robust promotion of India's national interest. Our sources detail what this comprehensive national interest included for India at the time. First and foremost, the protection of India's sovereignty and territorial integrity in a potentially hostile neighborhood.
Security first.
All right. Secondly, accelerating the socioeconomic development of India itself and also contributing to the development of the wider third world. And thirdly, promoting international peace and security, which was seen as a prerequisite for development and stability.
They saw peace as necessary for their own progress.
Absolutely. K.P. Misra is quoted articulating this interconnectedness. They looked upon international peace as a prerequisite to the achievement of this objective, and upon the Cold War, bloc politics and power politics as injurious and hence as requiring to be opposed.
So non-alignment was deeply rooted in pragmatic self-interest security, development, and stability, which required a peaceful international environment free from superpower proxy wars. It sounds quite practical when you put it that way.
It was a highly pragmatic policy, perhaps sometimes disguised in idealist language about peace and cooperation. A fundamental reason, reiterated by M.S. Rajan and J.N. Dixit, was the unwavering desire to retain and exercise independence of judgment and to avoid being tied to the apron strings of another country.
Didn't want to be anyone's puppet.
Pretty much. As Dixit succinctly puts it, being non-aligned means retaining the freedom to take decisions related to your interests without external influence to the extent possible. This is the core link between the policy of non-alignment and the broader goal of national freedom in foreign and defense policies. Deciding each issue on its own merits, based on India's needs and principles, was non-negotiable.
This links very strongly to the immense challenge of economic development facing a newly independent nation like India, right?
Indeed. Our source points out a key pragmatic economic driver. India desperately needed foreign economic aid, investment, and technology for its ambitious five-year plans aimed at lifting its population out of poverty and building a modern industrial base.
And non-alignment helped with that.
It offered a crucial advantage. It allowed India to seek and receive aid from both the U.S.-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. This diversification of aid sources was seen as both politically desirable, avoiding excessive dependence on a single power, and economically profitable, maximizing the potential pools of assistance available. You weren't putting all your eggs in one basket.
Smart. Beyond these practical imperatives of security, sovereignty, and development, there were also powerful ideological and emotional factors at play in India's decision, weren't there?
Absolutely. On the ideological front, it was difficult, if not impossible, for India to align with the Western Bloc. Why? Well, many of its prominent members were still colonial or ex-colonial powers who had dominated India or other parts of Asia and Africa. That history mattered.
Plus the issue of race.
Yes. Furthermore, some Western countries, notably the United States at the time, still practiced racial discrimination, which was completely anathema to the principles of equality that animated India's independence movement.
So the West wasn't a comfortable fit, but the Eastern Bloc wasn't a natural fit either.
No, not really. Our source explains that communism, as an ideology and a political system, was completely alien to Indian thinking and way of life. Nehru himself, while leaning towards socialist ideals in domestic policy, is described as having totally rejected the communist state as monolithic, seeing it as stifling individual liberty and diverse thought.
He didn't see it fitting India.
No. And he also viewed Marxism as an outmoded theory, not applicable to India's specific historical and social context. Nehru's own background combined elements of socialist thought with liberal democratic principles, making him fundamentally opposed to the rigid ideological divides represented by both power blocs.
So it wasn't just political calculation. There was a deep-seated philosophical aversion to the very concept of these confrontational, ideologically driven power blocs. This ties into the strong belief in promoting world peace, I imagine.
It does. Nehru genuinely believed that joining one group would not only limit India's freedom, but would also harm the cause of global peace. He argued that by remaining outside the blocs, India retained a tremendous vantage ground, the ability to use its influence to mediate, to bridge divides, to advocate for de-escalation and peaceful resolution of conflicts between the superpowers.
Trying to be a force for peace.
His quote from the U.S. Congress again resonates here. Our first effort should be to prevent that disaster world war from happening. This aspect of non-alignment also drew upon Gandhian principles of nonviolence and seeking peaceful solutions, as suggested in the source.
It was about maintaining the moral and political space to be constructive in a world teetering on the brink.
It was. And non-alignment was also fundamentally a stance against the existing global power structure, which was seen as inherently unequal and dominated by the great powers.
How did it challenge that status quo?
Well, our sources note that non-alignment was against the status quo situation in international relations. That meant opposition to colonialism, imperialism, racial discrimination, and later, neocolonialism. It was a policy that actively supported movements for liberation and self-determination around the world.
Standing up for the underdogs.
In a way, yes. Crucially, it rejected the concept of the superiority of superpowers, advocating for the sovereign equality of all states, large or small. Key Subramanian called non-alignment an assertion of autonomy in this international system dominated by the bipolar concept. It was about seeking a more just and equitable world order, free of domination and racialism, where all nations had equal opportunities to develop and thrive.
So it was also a powerful declaration of self-respect and the assertion of an equal place on the global stage for newly independent nations. A kind of, we're here and we'll decide for ourselves.
Precisely. And finally, a significant, maybe often overlooked factor was the domestic political situation within India. Professor Rajan believed that aligning India with either the Western or Eastern Bloc would have sown seeds of political controversy and instability in the country.
Ah, internal politics.
Yeah, India is a vastly diverse nation, and overt alignment with one superpower or the other, especially given the historical and ideological factors we've discussed, could have fractured domestic unity. Non-alignment, by contrast, enjoyed broad popular support across the political spectrum. It was something most people could agree on.
That's a really important insight that it also served a function of domestic cohesion in a young democracy facing immense internal challenges. So, non-alignment was far from a simple refusal to pick a side. It was a sophisticated, multifaceted policy born out of a complex blend of strategic necessities, economic imperatives, deep-seated ideological convictions, humanitarian goals, and domestic political realities.
It really was. It was a carefully designed strategy aimed at securing India's future, promoting its development, asserting its rightful place in the world, and contributing to global peace, all while safeguarding its hard-won independence.
With that solid understanding of the policy's foundations and motivations, let's trace how non-alignment actually played out on the international stage through India's experience. Like any foreign policy, it wasn't static. It faced real-world pressures and evolved through different historical phases. Our sources divide this journey into 5 broad periods.
Right. The first phase covers the years 1946 to 1954. This is the initial period where Nehru announced and began implementing the policy. Interestingly, the sources note that during these early years, India's non-alignment was allegedly, or was perceived by some, to be tilted towards the West, specifically the United States.
Allegedly. So, not necessarily the reality, but the perception. What gave rise to this idea of a Western tilt?
Several reasons are detailed in the sources. Firstly, India's defense establishment was heavily reliant on Britain for equipment, and the armed forces were organized along British lines. That's the colonial legacy.
Makes sense.
Secondly, a significant portion of India's political and intellectual elite, including Nehru himself, had been educated in Britain and were deeply influenced by British institutions and the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy. Thirdly, India's primary trade relations were inherited from the colonial era and remained largely with Western countries.
Economic ties.
And perhaps most crucially for a developing nation, India was heavily dependent on Western economic assistance, particularly from the United States, for its initial development plans.
And the Soviet Union's stance towards newly independent nations like India wasn't particularly welcoming in this early period, was it?
No, the sources indicate that early Soviet policy wasn't very favorable to developing countries outside the communist sphere. They often viewed them with suspicion or saw them as potential Western allies. Stalin reportedly expressed displeasure with India's early international approach.
So, despite these seemingly pro-Western leanings, rooted in history and economic necessity, the sources maintain that India was generally pursuing non-alignment during this time. How do they demonstrate that independence then?
This is where the nuances come in. Despite the legacy factors, India actively sought to position itself independently and even act as a bridge between the blocs. For instance, during the Korean crisis, India accepted the UN resolution identifying North Korea as the aggressor, which aligned with the Western view.
Okay.
However, it then opposed the UN forces crossing the 38th parallel into North Korea, which went against the U.S. position. India played a considerable diplomatic role, an appreciative role, as the source describes it, in helping to end the Korean crisis, demonstrating its independent agency.
So playing both sides. in a way.
or rather its own side. Furthermore, India was among the first non-communist countries to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1949, a move strongly opposed by the U.S.
That was a big deal.
Huge. While mutual understanding with the USSR was limited while Stalin was alive, the situation began to change after India notably refused the U.S. invitation to join the anti-communist Seato military alliance in 1954.
Ah, refusing Seato.
That refusal signaled clearly that India was not joining the Western Bloc, prompting the Socialist Bloc to begin seeking greater cooperation with India. It was a clear line in the sand.
That refusal of Seato seems like a pivotal moment, a clear assertion of non-bloc alignment. Okay, that takes us to the second phase, covering 1954 to 1962. What were the major developments and challenges here?
This period saw significant shifts in global power dynamics in India's relationships. Important leadership changes occurred in both superpowers. Eisenhower took over from Truman in the U.S., and Khrushchev succeeded Stalin in the USSR.
A new era.
And the sources suggest that Nehru's policy of friendship with all, even amidst Cold War tensions, actually helped both the U.S. and the USSR to gradually reassess the potential of non-alignment and see value in engaging with non-aligned states. Relations with Communist China also improved markedly, leading to the signing of the famous Panchsheel Agreement in 1954.
Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
That's the one. Mutual respect, non-aggression, non-interference, equality, and peaceful coexistence. A landmark agreement at the time.
And relations with the Soviet Union also began to warm up considerably after Stalin's death.
Yes, significantly. Following the Panchsheel Agreement, the first visit of top Soviet leaders, Khrushchev and Bulganin, to India in 1955 was a major event. This visit solidified closer ties based on the shared principle of peaceful coexistence and marked a thaw in Indo-Soviet relations that would become increasingly important.
But this phase also presented significant challenges that tested India's policy and its perceived equidistance, didn't it?
Oh yes, the dual crises of 1956 are often cited here.
Suez and Hungary.
Right. In the Suez Crisis, Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. India strongly and unequivocally condemned this action, aligning with the Soviet Union and global sentiment against the former colonial powers.
Okay, clear stance there.
Almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union brutally suppressed an uprising in Hungary. India's reaction to this was notably different. It offered only a half-hearted objection after some initial hesitation.
And that perceived imbalance in India's response drew significant criticism, a double standard.
It did. The source notes this discriminatory attitude made the West unhappy. It highlighted the practical difficulty of maintaining genuinely equidistant relations and maybe reinforced the idea that India's decisions, while framed as being based on merit, could appear tilted depending on the issue and whose actions were being judged. It showed principles sometimes bent to strategic considerations or perhaps historical grievances, like anti-colonialism.
This period also saw India take direct military action in 1961 to liberate Goa from Portuguese rule. That seems quite forceful for a non-aligned peace-advocating nation.
That's correct. And it happened at a particularly interesting moment, just as Nehru, Nasser, and Tito were actively preparing for the first formal summit to launch the non-aligned movement.
Wow, talk about timing.
India used force to end Portugal's long colonial presence in Goa. The Western powers, notably the U.S. and Britain, reacted with strong condemnation, describing India's action as naked aggression. This was particularly jarring to them, given India's vocal advocacy for peace.
How did India defend it?
India's defense, articulated forcefully by figures like Defense Minister V.K. Krishna Menon, was that colonialism itself was a permanent state of aggression, justifying military action in the national interest to end it. Basically, Portugal shouldn't have been there in the first place.
So even as India was about to formalize a global movement based on non-alignment, it took decisive, independent military action that flew in the face of Western opinion. That starkly illustrates that preserving national interests and sovereignty could trump perceived adherence to Western norms or expectations of a peace-at-all-costs approach.
Exactly. It showed the pragmatic core of the policy independence of action for national interest was paramount. Despite these complex dynamics and criticisms, India actively worked to strengthen the idea of non-alignment globally during this phase. India played a significant role in the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian Nations in 1955.
The forerunner to NM.
Right, widely seen as a crucial precursor. India also contributed troops for UN peacekeeping missions, such as in Congo in 1960, demonstrating its commitment to international cooperation outside of bloc politics.
Moving into the third phase, from 1962 to 1971, this period is described as being under stress and seems marked by significant challenges and shifts in India's approach. Sounds tough.
It was undoubtedly a turbulent time that severely tested non-alignment. The most impactful event was the Chinese aggression in 1962. This border war came as a profound shock to India.
A shock because of Panchsheel.
Partly, yes. It damaged India's international prestige, lowered national morale, and led to a period of intense introspection and questioning of the non-alignment policy itself.
How did India's perceived friends and non-aligned partners react during this crisis? Did they rally around India?
This is where the policy faced its most acute test. The sources note that the Soviet Union, despite warning ties, did not provide the level of support India expected during its conflict with China. Perhaps more significantly and, well, dishearteningly for India, most of the fellow non-aligned countries did not condemn the Chinese aggression or offer meaningful support.
Ouch. So much for solidarity.
This lack of solidarity from expected quarters was a stark wake-up call about the limitations of non-aligned friendship in a real security crisis.
But then there was unexpected help from the other side.
Yes, in a twist of fate, unexpectedly, Britain and the United States offered help and assistance to India in terms of arms and logistical support against China.
Yeah.
This created a very complex situation, both internally and externally.
This must have fueled the critics within India who questioned non-alignment all along.
Absolutely. Prominent figures like C. Rajagopalatari, Acharya Kripalani, J.B. Kripalani, and Jayaprakash Narayan openly debated the policy, suggesting it should be abandoned or significantly modified. They argued that accepting Western arms helped demonstrate the policy's failure to protect India and highlighted the necessity of stronger security ties, even if it meant compromising strict non-alignment.
And the West piled on.
Well, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan seized the moment to publicly argue that the Chinese aggression showed that neutrality or neutralism offered no real guarantee against aggression and was ultimately an unrealistic foreign policy. Essentially, we told you so.
Michael Breacher's analysis describing this as non-alignment under stress is mentioned. What were his conclusions about this period?
Breacher argued that the policy shifted during this time. He saw it moving from an aspirational equidistance to a more pragmatic, equal proximity to both Moscow and Washington, basically engaging with both as needed without strict ideological barriers. He also suggested a shift from active involvement to a more passive form of non-alignment, even claiming it became an empty shell.
An empty shell? That's harsh. But the sources seem to disagree with that specific idea.
They do. While acknowledging the stress and the shifts, the sources push back against the notion that the policy became entirely powerless or irrelevant. They imply that while the ideal of strict equidistance proved challenging and the security guarantees imagined by some weren't there, the core principle of maintaining independent judgment and flexibility remained valuable. It wasn't dead yet.
And what was Nehru's response to the calls for abandoning the policy during this crisis?
Nehru remained committed. He refused to abandon it despite the criticism. He argued pragmatically that non-alignment was still crucial because it allowed India to continue receiving economic assistance, loans, and easy payment terms from both blocs, aid that would likely cease if India formally joined one side.
The economic argument again?
Yes. He even called giving up non-alignment a terrible moral failure, although the source notes that M.S. Rajan correctly pointed out that non-alignment was a political policy, not really a moral principle, and conflating the two was perhaps inaccurate.
So despite the crisis, the formal adherence to non-alignment continued, though the sources note once again there was a shift towards the West in practical terms due to the security needs and Western assistance.
This shift was somewhat temporary, though. After Nehru's death in 1964, Lal Bahadur Shastri became prime minister. His brief tenure, 1964-66 to 76, saw India facing a severe food shortage. The United States reportedly attempted to leverage this
Pressure tactic.
by demanding India support its Vietnam War policy as a condition for aid. Shastri refused, leading to an undiplomatic and insulting postponement of his scheduled visit to the U.S. by President Johnson.
Wow. That experience seems to have reinforced the dangers of over-reliance on one power, didn't it? Then came the 1965 India-Pakistan War. How did that impact India's trajectory and its view of non-alignment?
The 1965 war was another critical moment. In this conflict, both the United States and China gave moral and political support to Pakistan. Despite these external pressures, India fought the war and achieved a decisive victory.
A significant military win.
Yes, and it significantly enhanced India's international prestige and demonstrated its growing military capability and potential as a regional power. The lack of support or outright opposition from the Western Bloc during this war, coupled with the earlier aid pressure from the U.S., naturally pushed India further towards cultivating closer ties with the Soviet Union.
And Indira Gandhi became prime minister in 1966, inheriting this complex situation. How did she navigate non-alignment during the latter part of this stressful phase?
Indira Gandhi faced complex challenges. She attempted to revitalize Afro-Asian unity and held summits with key non-aligned leaders like Tito and Nasser. India continued its independent foreign policy stances, for instance, giving full support to Arab nations against Israel in the 1967 Six-Day War, a position that once again displeased the West.
Consistently pro-Arab.
Yes. But paradoxically, despite improving ties with the USSR, the Soviets began supplying armaments to Pakistan in 1968, a move that understandably caused India considerable protest.
Selling arms to their rival, that must have stung.
It did. Yet when the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia later that year to suppress the Prague Spring, India notably did not join the West in condemning the action.
Another balancing act, or maybe inconsistency.
Well, it led to renewed accusations from Indian critics that non-alignment was being compromised or was effectively pro-Soviet. Then came the Rabat Conference in 1969.
What happened there?
It was an Islamic summit, and the Indian delegate was humiliatingly denied entry due to opposition from Pakistan and some Arab nations. This was seen as a severe blow and humiliation for India's foreign policy, highlighting the challenges of unity even within the broader Afro-Asian or Muslim world that NM often sought to represent.
So this entire phase leading up to 1971 was really characterized by India weathering external pressures, internal debates, and navigating a complex international environment that sometimes seemed unsupportive of its core policy, a real trial by fire.
Absolutely, a very testing time for non-alignment.
Which brings us to the highly significant fourth phase, spanning from 1971 to 1990. This period is widely seen as one where India's policy showed a distinct tilt towards the Soviet Union, particularly initiated by the events of 1971.
That's right. The crisis of 1971 fundamentally reshaped India's immediate strategic calculus and visibly affected its non-alignment posture. India faced an enormous humanitarian and security crisis due to the brutal suppression by the Pakistani military in East Pakistan.
Which led to Bangladesh.
Exactly. This suppression led to millions of refugees streaming into India. As tensions escalated, Pakistan forced a war on India in December 1971.
And once again, the international alignment during the conflict seemed to mirror past patterns, the U.S. and China siding with Pakistan.
Precisely. The United States and China notably sided with Pakistan. U.S. President Nixon even sent the USS Enterprise carrier battle group into the Bay of Bengal and issued warnings to Indira Gandhi, hinting at potential intervention against India.
Serious threat.
Very serious. Faced with this dire threat and lacking guaranteed support from other quarters, India made a pivotal strategic move. It signed the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the Soviet Union in August 1971, just before the war escalated.
The Indo-Soviet Treaty. What were the crucial provisions of this treaty that led to the perception of a tilt or even alignment? Why was it so controversial regarding non-alignment?
The treaty contained several key articles. It pledged mutual respect for sovereignty and integrity. Crucially, it stipulated that neither country would participate in any military alliance directed against the other, and they would abstain from assisting any third party engaged in armed conflict with the other.
Sounds like a security understanding.
It was, and Article 9X was particularly significant. It stated that in case of attack or threat thereof, the parties would immediately enter into mutual consultations to remove the threat and take appropriate effective measures to ensure their peace and security.
Appropriate effective measures. That sounds close to a defense pact.
It certainly implied a strong security commitment. And this treaty, signed under immense pressure and providing a form of security assurance, was met with sharp criticism in India, wasn't it?
Intensely so. Critics argued that by signing this treaty, especially Article 9, India had effectively abandoned non-alignment and instead aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The argument was the treaty seemed to pledge the kind of diplomatic and military support India urgently needed against the U.S.-China-backed Pakistan, thus violating the spirit, if not the letter, of non-alignment.
But did this criticism gain traction?
The sources note that despite the intensity of this criticism from some political circles, these critics did not gain widespread popular support. The treaty proved strategically effective. It arguably deterred direct U.S. intervention, and Indo-Soviet relations deepened considerably,
While Indo-U.S. relations.
reached an all-time low. The source concludes that while India formally maintained the label of non-alignment, the tilt towards USSR became clear and apparent during and after this period.
Okay. After the period of Indira Gandhi's emergency and her subsequent electoral defeat, the Janata government came to power in 1977. Did they attempt to reverse this jilt or alter non-alignment?
The Janata government, 1977-79, did not fundamentally alter the policy of non-alignment. The new foreign minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, famously spoke of pursuing genuine non-alignment.
Genuine. Implying the previous wasn't.
Well, implying a desire to correct the perceived unnecessary tilt towards USSR that had developed. However, even he did not turn India against the Soviet Union and actively sought to normalize relations with both China and Pakistan, aiming for better balance.
Trying to rebalance things.
Right. A notable decision during this period was Prime Minister Morarji Desai's refusal to sign the Discriminatory Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, despite significant pressure from U.S. President Jimmy Carter during his visit.
Standing firm on the NPT.
Desai viewed the NPT as discriminatory and against India's national interest, demonstrating a continued commitment to independent decision-making on key security issues, regardless of U.S. pressure. The source notes that while many Janata leaders were generally perceived as more pro-West than Indira Gandhi, the government ultimately gave no practical evidence of deviating from the established framework of Indo-Soviet friendship or the core tenets of non-alignment. The treaty remained.
Interesting. And after the Janata government fell, India returned to leadership under Indira Gandhi in 1980, followed by Rajiv Gandhi after her assassination. How did non-alignment fare in the 1980s under them?
Indira Gandhi's second tenure, 1980-84, and Rajiv Gandhi's government, 1984-89, largely maintained the trajectory from the post-1971 period. They kept very cordial and close relations with the Soviet Union.
So the perceived tilt continued.
Yes, which again led to continued charges from critics of compromising non-alignment. Examples cited include India's consistent anti-Israel posture, which continued to annoy Western countries, its unwavering refusal to sign the NPT, and its policy of not criticizing the Soviet intervention and occupation of Afghanistan, which lasted from 1979 to 1988. That silence on Afghanistan was particularly noted.
Yet India remained a prominent and active participant in the non-aligned movement itself throughout this phase, didn't it?
Absolutely. India continued its active role and even hosted the 7th NAM Summit in New Delhi in 1983, underscoring its commitment to the movement despite the criticisms regarding its bilateral relations.
Hosting the summit is a big statement.
It is. The source does mention an earlier point of criticism regarding India's non-opposition to Cuban President Fidel Castro's statement at the 1979 Havana Summit that the Soviet Union was a natural friend of the non-aligned movement.
Natural friend. That sounds pretty aligned.
Exactly. The source attributes India's muted reaction at that specific summit to it having a caretaker government at the time, suggesting perhaps a lack of decisive leadership on that particular phrasing. But this phase concludes around 1990, just as the Cold War was formally ending.
Fall of the Berlin Wall in '89.
Right, and the imminent disintegration of the USSR in '91. These events would inevitably place a massive question mark on the very concept of non-alignment in a world no longer defined by two superpowers and opposing blocs. The whole foundations seem to be crumbling.
That monumental shift brings us perfectly to Section 5, the non-aligned movement, NAM itself. Because non-alignment wasn't just an Indian foreign policy, it grew into this large, collective movement of many nations.
That's right. And the source states quite clearly that India was largely responsible for the formation and launching of the formal non-aligned movement in 1961.
Alongside Tito and Nasser.
Exactly. It was initiated by those three key charismatic leaders who became known as the triumvirate of non-alignment: Nehru of India, President Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, and President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt.
Where and when did the movement formally kick off?
The first official NM conference was held in Belgrade, Yugoslavia in September 1961. It was presided over by President Tito and attended by representatives from 25 countries, mostly newly independent states from Asia and Africa, plus Yugoslavia and Cuba.
And getting an invite wasn't automatic.
No, the process of selecting attendees was quite deliberate. Invitations were sent out by Nehru, Nasser, and Tito after careful scrutiny of prospective countries' foreign policies to ensure they genuinely met certain criteria. They wanted members who were truly committed to the principles.
And these criteria were formalized for joining the movement. What exactly were they?
Yes, the source details the 5 specific criteria that were agreed upon for a state to become a member of NA. Let's see.
Okay.
1. The country must follow an independent foreign policy based on non-alignment and peaceful coexistence. Foundational, right?
Makes sense. Independent policy first.
2. The country must consistently be opposed to colonialism and imperialism. This reflected the common historical experience and ongoing struggle of many potential members.
Anti-colonialism was key.
3. It should not have been a member of a Cold War-related multilateral military alliance or pact, like NATO, the Warsaw Pact, SEATO, or CENTO. No bloc members allowed.
Clear line there.
4. It should not have had a bilateral military treaty with any superpower. Now, the source notes, importantly, that this particular criterion was violated by many members later on.
Like the Indo-Soviet Treaty, arguably.
Well, that's the kind of debate it sparked. It reflects the pressures and complexities states faced. And 5. It should not have allowed any foreign military base on its territory. This aimed to prevent members from becoming forward operating bases for the superpowers.
Okay, so those criteria essentially codified the principles of independent action in opposition to bloc politics and domination that underpinned non-alignment.
Pretty much. And the movement saw significant growth over the decades, didn't it?
Indeed. Quantitatively, it grew substantially, from those 25 members at Belgrade in 1961 to as many as 118 member states by the time of the Havana Summit in 2006. That's a huge chunk of the UN. Qualitatively, its influence and role also evolved. Summits were held periodically, usually every 3 years, providing a platform for member states to discuss major international, political, and economic issues and attempt to evolve common approaches or stances.
Attempt being the key word sometimes. Unity must have been hard with so many diverse members.
Extremely hard. Adopting a common approach was often difficult due to the sheer number and diversity of members, each with their own national interests.
What were the main issues that historically united NM members, the things they could agree on and focus their efforts on?
Historically, the issues that provided common ground and purpose for NM were decolonization, the fight against anti-imperialism, the struggle against racial discrimination, particularly apartheid in South Africa, and supporting the cause of Palestine. These were the big rallying cries.
But the source points out that the first 3, decolonization, anti-imperialism, and anti-racial discrimination, are largely no more issues of concern, in the same way they were during the height of the movement. Apartheid ended, colonies gained independence.
Precisely. History moved on. And while Palestine remains a concern, it's also pursued in numerous other international forums. The source notes that even during the Cold War, NE's role on these issues, while providing a collective voice and platform, was largely limited to helping focus attention and give general political and moral support. It didn't possess the means to solve these complex global problems on its own. It was more about advocacy than action.
This reality, combined with the end of the Cold War, must have created significant challenges for NM in the post-Cold War era. If the old enemies were gone, what was the point?
It did. With the original raison d'etre navigating a bipolar, bloc-dominated world seemingly gone, and many of its core historical issues resolved or lessened, the movement faced serious questions about its continued purpose and unity. The unity issues in the post-Cold War world are simply not the same as they were when fighting a common enemy like colonialism.
So what should it focus on now, according to the source?
The source suggests that for NAM to remain relevant, it should mainly concern itself with contemporary issues, such as global violence and terrorism, pervasive global economic inequalities, human rights concerns, and environmental challenges, seeking to build global consensus where possible. New threats, new focus.
And many of the original objectives seem to be pursued elsewhere now anyway, through regional groups.
Yes. The source notes that many goals originally pursued through AM are now actively addressed through various regional organizations like SARC in South Asia, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, and APEC in the Asia-Pacific. Furthermore, the uneven pace of technological and economic development across the developing world has led to significant inequalities and divergent interests among NA members themselves, making it even harder to forge common approaches. Some members are much richer or more developed than others now.
Leading figures have offered thoughts on how NAM could adapt its role, haven't they? What did they suggest?
J.N. Dixit, for instance, suggested that for NAM to have a meaningful future, it must move away from its orthodoxies and repetitive hortatory pronouncements.
Less rhetoric, more substance.
Essentially, yes. He argued it needs to become more pragmatic and focus on new challenges to developing countries, specifically mentioning issues like the transfer of technology and investments, addressing social and educational issues, engaging with human rights concerns, and navigating the political implications of the rapidly evolving new power equations in the international system. M.K. Rasgatra offered a similar view, suggesting M should take on critical global social issues like drug abuse, exploitation of women, poverty, disease, and environmental degradation.
Despite these suggestions for adaptation, there's also the persistent criticism that conferences can sometimes be seen as merely talk shops, right? All declaration, no action.
That criticism is acknowledged in the source, reflecting doubts about the movement's tangible effectiveness in the current global landscape. However, the source also provides examples of post-Cold War NAM summits, where the movement did continue to address significant contemporary global issues, demonstrating a collective will to remain active, even if impact is debated.
Like the Durban Summit in South Africa in 1998, what happened there?
Yes, the 12th NAM summit was held in Durban, attended by 113 member countries, and notably presided over by Nelson Mandela. India, represented by Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, faced some anxious moments here.
Why anxious?
President Mandela, in his opening address, mentioned Jammu and Kashmir and hinted at a potential role for mediation, which India strongly objected to, asserting it was a bilateral issue. South Africa later clarified that no interference was intended. There was also an attempt within the summit by some members to condemn India and Pakistan for their nuclear tests earlier that year.
How did India handle that?
India successfully resisted this, arguing against a discriminatory approach to nuclear weapons. The summit ultimately expressed anxiety about the tests and called for a universal, non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament regime. India's proposal for an international conference on the complete elimination of weapons of mass destruction was also adopted. Pakistan also raised the Kashmir issue again, and India responded forcefully, reiterating its stance and demanding an end to cross-border terrorism. So some real political maneuvering.
And the Havana Summit in 2006 is another example cited of NM tackling current issues.
Right. The 14th NAM Summit was held in Havana, Cuba, chaired by Raul Castro, and attended by 118 nations. India, represented by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, addressed the gathering, notably rejecting the concept of a clash of civilizations and calling for the movement to focus on urgent transnational issues like terrorism, energy security, and the environment.
Taking on big global themes.
Yes. The summit's declaration opposed terrorism in all its forms, called for the prosecution and extradition of perpetrators, and expressed concern about the regrouping of terrorist groups like the Taliban, but without specifically naming Pakistan as the location. The summit also supported India's long-standing campaign for reforms in the United Nations, particularly the expansion and reform of the Security Council. It also expressed hope for a diplomatic resolution of the Iran nuclear issue. Crucially, the Havana Declaration reiterated NAM's fundamental relevance.
Even in 2006.
Yes, reiterated its relevance in a world that had shifted from a clear bipolar structure to a more complex, fluid, and interconnected landscape. They were still arguing for its place.
So despite the end of the Cold War and internal challenges, NMM has continued to function, meeting periodically and attempting to articulate collective positions on current global problems, even if its historical impact on major political issues was often limited to focusing attention and its unity faces new strains.
It hasn't just disappeared.
It has persevered, trying to find its footing and purpose in a vastly altered international system. Perhaps a testament to the desire of many developing nations to maintain a collective voice, however imperfectly that works sometimes.
This naturally leads us to the core question posed throughout this exploration, the big one. With the formal end of the Cold War in 1989-1990, the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the world shifting away from a strictly bipolar structure, is non-alignment still relevant? Does it mean anything anymore? This is the central debate presented by our sources when looking at the post-Cold War era. The initial argument against relevance is quite direct. If non-alignment was conceived as a specific response to the unique context of the Cold War and bipolarity, a way to avoid being drawn into the superpower conflict, then surely, with that context gone, the policy itself should be redundant. It served its purpose. Time to move on.
That makes logical sense.
K. Subramaniam, cited in the source, represents this view clearly. He argued that non-alignment had a contextual significance and was not an enduring ideology. He believed it was relevant for a particular time and power configuration, which is now transforming very radically, necessitating that former non-aligned countries assess very carefully the newly evolving international environment to update their strategy. adapt, or become irrelevant.
There's also the argument mentioned that the very freedom of action non-alignment championed is now more widespread anyway, so it's not special anymore.
Yes, the source mentions the general belief that non-alignment has little relevance in political sense, because now every nation is indeed taking independent foreign policy decisions. The idea here is that the constraints imposed by the Cold War blocs are gone, and states are inherently freer to pursue their interests, making the non-aligned label less distinctive or necessary. Everyone's non-aligned now, in a way.
Okay, that's the case against. However, the sources also make a compelling case for the continued relevance of non-alignment, or at least its underlying principles, even in a changed world. What's that argument?
They do. They argue that the three key fundamental reasons India initially adopted non-alignment are still valid objectives, regardless of whether the world is bipolar, unipolar, multipolar, or fluid.
Okay, what are those three again?
Firstly, the objective of independent foreign policy decision-making remains crucial. The desire for India, or any nation, to make decisions in its own capital based on its own interests, and not dictated by outside powers, whether that was Washington or Moscow during the Cold War or any dominant power or group of powers today, is an enduring aspiration.
The desire for autonomy never goes away.
Exactly. The source even suggests this independence is more possible for all nations now. But the principle behind non-alignment, the assertion of the right to independent judgment, is still highly relevant. Jay and Dixit's point about retaining freedom to take decisions without external influence is seen as applying just as much now.
Okay, independence. What's the second reason?
Secondly, the economic development aspect. The possibility of seeking aid, investment, and technology from diverse global sources without being tied to a single patron remains strategically beneficial for developing nations.
Still useful to shop around.
Absolutely. While the Cold War blockade dynamic is gone, global economic relations are complex, and diversification of partners is still a prudent strategy. The source notes that cooperation among developing countries, which NAM aimed to foster, is still needed in the face of globalization, and forums like NM could potentially still facilitate this, even if its track record is mixed.
Makes sense. And thirdly,
The core objectives of promoting international peace and the peaceful settlement of disputes. These objectives are, if anything, even more universally important in a world still grappling with conflict, terrorism, and transnational threats. Non-alignment fundamentally advocated for these principles, along with disarmament and strengthening international institutions like the UN. These are timeless goals that transcend the Cold War context. Peace is always relevant.
and Indian leaders themselves, after the Cold War, publicly affirmed its continued validity, didn't they?
Yes, quite strongly. Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in 1991 and 1992 explicitly reaffirmed India's adherence to non-alignment. He argued that it was more relevant in the post-Cold War world precisely because it championed the rights of all nations to independence and development regardless of the bloc phenomenon.
So relevant because the blocks were gone.
That was his argument. He stated that the fundamental urge to maintain independence persists whether there is one bloc or more, and boldly declared that the chimera of hegemony must not be pursued, clearly referencing a unipolar temptation after the Cold War, a warning against a single dominant power.
MS Rajan also strongly defended its relevance, particularly for smaller or weaker states, right?
Yes, Rajan contended that non-alignment as a viable foreign policy option for states seeking autonomy remains relevant whatever the world is bipolar, multipolar, or unipolar. His crucial point is that it's relevant so long as great power hegemony exists in any form. As long as there are powerful states capable of exerting undue influence, the principle of non-alignment asserting independent judgment and avoiding subservience retains its value.
So as long as power imbalances exist, it's relevant.
That's his view. I.K. Gujral, during his time as External Affairs Minister and later PM in the late 1990s, also confirmed India's continued belief in the policy, stating there was no possibility of becoming irrelevant anytime soon.
And the 2006 Havana NAM summit, as we discussed, also explicitly reiterated the movement's relevance in a changing, fluid world. They weren't ready to fold up shop.
No, this collective statement shows that many nations, despite the changed landscape, still saw value in the principles and the platform provided by NM, even if its focus needed to adapt.
So, to synthesize the arguments presented in the sources, there's a real tension between viewing non-alignment as a relic of a specific Cold War context and seeing its core principles as having enduring value, contextual versus fundamental.
That's exactly the tension. The source seems to lean towards the view that while its original political relevance as a direct counterpoint to the two blocs might be diminished, non-alignment remains valid as an instrument of economic development and social change, leveraging diverse global opportunities. More importantly, it argues that the fundamental objectives that gave birth to the policy independence, development, and peace still exist.
The goals remain.
The goals remain. The core principle of independent decision-making in a world where power dynamics and potential hegemony haven't disappeared, even if the structure is less rigid, ensures the spirit of non-alignment persists, even if the name or the movement itself evolves or fades.
What an incredible journey through a policy that shapes so much of the post-war world. We've covered its origins in the intense tensions of the Cold War as India's answer to bloc politics, clarified what it truly meant by contrasting it with neutrality, neutralization, and isolationism, delved into the deep strategic, economic, ideological, and domestic reasons for its adoption by India.
A complex mix.
Traced its challenging evolution through different historical phases marked by external pressures and internal debates, including those periods of perceived tilt towards one side or the other.
The stress test.
And examined its role in the non-aligned movement and the complex debate over its relevance in the post-Cold War world we're still living in.
It's clear that non-alignment for India was never a static dogma, was it? It was a dynamic foreign policy instrument, constantly tested and adapted, while striving, maybe not always perfectly, but striving to hold on to the core principles of independent action and prioritizing national interest and global peace.
And the sources present a compelling argument that while the specific form of non-alignment or the role of the movement may need to adapt to contemporary challenges like terrorism, economic inequality, and environmental issues.
The new global agenda.
The fundamental principle at the heart of it, the assertion of a nation's right to make independent foreign policy decisions for its own benefit and for the broader goals of global well-being, might be a universally relevant concept for any state navigating a world that, as the sources acknowledge, still grapples with significant power dynamics, potential hegemony, and the ongoing pursuit of development and security.
Yes. The question for you, the listener, to ponder, really building on the source's debate about its continued validity, is whether that core spirit of non-alignment, this drive for autonomous decision-making, for carving out space for independent action in a world of powerful actors and competing interests, lives on today. Perhaps not always explicitly labeled as non-alignment or under the banner of NAM, but as an underlying strategic principle guiding the foreign policy choices of nations determined to safeguard their sovereignty and pursue their interests in a complex and ever-shifting international system.
Does that core aspiration for independence endure even if the Cold War is indeed over and the blocs have dissolved?
That's the lingering question, isn't it?
A powerful thought to leave with.